All right, we'll call the Governance Committee meeting to order at 7:30. And we'll keep an eye out for Dan. Three items and then one real small additional one. In the past, this committee's really taken a kind of a deep look, probably a month earlier, at sort of negative things in the state budget specific to IDAs and maybe other authorities. And believe it or not, at least as we can see and at least as we've talked to the New York State EDC, there really were not the typical extension of challenges and or reforms to IDAs or other authorities. I think that's only because they were so busy with so many other, high-profile items that it just didn't make it onto the docket. But I did want to address two things very quickly. One that is in the American Rescue Plan. It's on that first page there. And it won't be something that we directly facilitate, but certainly will educate, is the federal government had for a number of years what they call the SSBCI, or the State Small Business Credit Initiative. And it's what it almost sounds like, but think more traditional, non-disaster, non-emergency credit. I think it sort of sat out there as a shell, but it hasn't been funded or capitalized for a number of years. That in the American Rescue Plan, i.e. the 1.9 trillion stimulus plan, does fund it and capitalize it. I think there's a total of $10 billion. I do follow a site that as it becomes active and as banks and or others can alert small businesses to this new credit initiative, we'll be sure to kind of let folks know. And maybe we've had some businesses take advantage of it in the past. I'm not sure. The other piece that I will do some research on next week is, and I may have vaguely referenced this, there is $3 billion in the EDA at the federal level, U.S. Economic Development Administration. And those dollars are for everything from COVID work that we did to maybe lack of resources due to COVID and or grants going forward. So I need to research it a bit. I mean, that stimulus bill's not that old yet, and certainly New York State Economic Development Council hasn't provided any feedback yet. But again, it's sort of a refunding, which the EDA typically hasn't had much funding. So I'll keep an eye out on those. From the New York State budget, I suppose the only highlight was, as I said, there really was no IDA or authorities regulation expansion. The only bill that I think that we'll see and indirectly pay attention to is that there was an element in it that passed that explicitly authorizes IDAs to incentivize renewable energy projects. I'm not sure why they felt the need for that, other than I think the governor's just trying to eliminate any and all barriers to being able to do these renewable energy projects. The one piece that I think's a bit more important to find out is, we've talked a bit about this 575B. That's a law in New York State, or the plans to be a law potentially in New York State, that would much more dictate how pilots around renewable projects are done. And again, whether that was us doing a pilot or whether it was Tom facilitating a pilot, with the town. In those cases, the two main scenarios are, one, the maximum of 15 years for those pilots, and most notably, it changes it from a fee per megawatt to a discounted cash flow model of what the developers are anticipating their power purchase revenue will be. So we'll see if it's in there. If it is in there, supposedly the law, the Ort's office sent us the bill, gave the state 6 months to figure it out. So you can just get a sense of the push around renewables. Not so much directly involved with us, but you never know. There is a significant increase in personal income taxes, supposedly for 4 straight years, for individuals above $1 million and couples above $2 million. And then more germane to us, and I still get nervous because I'm not convinced it'll sunset, but there is a 1-year increase in the corporate tax rate from 6.5% to 7.25%. And I think the only part of that that surprises me is that, you know, a lot of these businesses aren't really back on their footing since COVID. You know, they certainly don't have a clear sense of where they're headed, and yet, you know, here you are going to jam them up on a corporate tax increase. So those are really the only highlights. We may find some other things that come out of as people really parse through it and so on, but I suppose the one positive again is that there really wasn't the bandwidth to be paying attention to extending regulations on IDAs, unless you look at the 575B as that. So, all right. Second thing that we tend to typically do at this meeting is, and I gave you a blank copy of it, is usually in the fall, like August or September, we'll distribute the evaluation of board performance. That is a requirement of authorities. That is a question that does get asked on Paris. They don't ask you to upload it, just that you completed one. So we did update it a year ago, but I'm more than happy to add or modify. Bob and I were talking earlier, and you know, I think the board continues to score well with a couple minor exceptions. One was number 9. The board members are knowledgeable about authority programs, financial statements, reporting requirements, and other transactions. Some of that's, you know, you can lead a horse to water, but I'm also obviously more than willing to over-communicate or find specific things. And then the other one that didn't score as bad was 13, that there's some given opportunity for board members to research, discuss, and question decisions before a vote's taken. But so, yeah, I don't expect you this morning necessarily to see if you've got any.
What if we changed it to I? Instead of board members are knowledgeable, I am knowledgeable. I'm still anonymous.
Sure. Rather than it being the nebulous collective board, it's me personally. Yeah. Okay.
On the one item where we think we might have concern.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know, Jane, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Or I could well, it doesn't, I was going to say myself and or board members, but then you're not really clear which avenues are. But sure, let me do a draft of that, and I can bring it to the May board meeting just to see how the full board likes that. But I think that's a worthy.
And maybe it's not long term. Maybe it's just for a couple of years.
Yeah. Sure.
Were you talking about both those questions, or just number 9?
No, just number 9, really. As much as on a trial as anything else. See how that goes. And we can change it next year, too.
Right.
All right. The other more substantive piece is I just want to do a review of the Paris report, which is obviously our major compliance submittal. I think everybody's aware, but the 2020, remember Paris is always the year before, so in January, February, March, when we work on it, we're really working on up to 12/31/20, in this case, information, which does get sometimes confusing, but nonetheless. So that has been filed. We filed it in mid-March, and it was certified. What I wanted to do was remind you what the elements are, and I can point out the 2 or 3 main changes, but it was really, when the year was quiet, it somewhat makes Paris quiet and straightforward. The main element is what they refer to as the annual report, And it's everything from items on the board, items around governance, i.e., does the board complete a self-evaluation, a listing of staff members, interesting enough for both the staff and for the board. And I think it's old school. You'd be, probably like me, somewhat saddened to think that they still need to ask these questions. But under the board, there's a whole series of questions about benefits that accrue to authority board members. And those are severance package, paid for unused leave, club memberships, use of corporate credit card, personal loans, auto, transportation, housing allowance, spousal and or dependent life insurance, tuition assistance, and multi-year employment, which seems strange. That may be more applicable to the staff. And they asked that same question of the staff. But I think way back in the day when Paris kind of came about, I think there were authorities that had done some of that stuff, but obviously in our case it's none of the above. That annual report also still has summary financials, our debt, our real property that we still own, and then there are one-page templates for every single project that has everything from when did that pilot start to, you know, is it a leasehold scenario, but more importantly, you list the jobs reported for that year. And the hardest part for that template is we reach out to the taxing authorities ahead of time and say, what did company X owe and did they pay it? And they're good about getting back to us. What a bit more challenging is the other aspect of this says, well, what should they have paid? And with assessments changing and so on, there's a little bit of math we have to do every year of saying, hey, that's now assessed at $200,000 higher, and we know that the county's rate is 6.94 per thousand, and the school district X, and so on. But we put together a spreadsheet. So that's the type of stuff that you do see on the templates. The next section is a budget report. That's kind of a pain in the neck, too, I would say, because it likes to see the prior year, your current year, which would have been 2020. One of the reasons we adopt the next year so early is it then asks to see the next year's adopted budget, i.e. there was board activity. And then the part that I find the most not all that productive is you then have to provide a budget for 3 out years. And, you know, when we're trying to sit there and guess how many projects or what land you might sell and so on. So a lot of that stuff I just keep steady and maybe do like a 2% increase on taxes. And really, in any of those out years, we just simply present a balanced budget and move on. There is a whole section on the certified financial audit that includes the audit itself, the 1231 financial statements as presented by, in our case, Lumsden, the management letter, and then there is a one-page letter that comes from Lumsden that certifies sort of our compliance with New York State public authorities laws as related to fiscal stuff. There's an investment report, but that's really kind of wimpy. It's really what's your investment policy and does it allow for some strange things. And then in our case, it's strictly listing our checking and savings accounts, 1231 balance, and what was the interest. And then lastly, there's a procurement report that does have kind of a half-page template for each vendor that we had disbursements of greater than $5,000 in the previous fiscal year. There is some vendor details and any agreements you have, and then the actual disbursements itself. For us, this year, the vendors that were paid greater than $5,000 were Ecology and Environment at $85.96, Invest Buffalo, that's spot on at $5K for the dues, Seaman Norris at $28,385, the town of Lockport for $58,378, and then the town of Lockport receiver of taxes for $5,441. So those are our 5 vendors that we had to report out information on. Because it was a really simple year, the only thing I would say to you that's different from this year to last year is Spring Lake. When you're done, there is an opportunity to go and say, okay, this is it for Pilot X, it's over. So we had to move Spring Lake from current active pilot to a closed pilot. And then, believe it or not, in reviewing things, and it may have been because of my newness, a year ago, Contracts Unlimited original pilot ended, and it still sat out there looking like an active pilot, but I was able still to close it out and make a note as to, why that may have been the case. So those are really the only two new things that we had to do in 20, other than they had called us a year ago and said, we don't like the way, quote unquote, Kate is reporting my salary and the secretary's salary. It reported them as all in the IDA. And because you check a box saying, hey, are the staff at all paid by any other entity? And we obviously checked yes and checked the town of Lockport. They simply made us take half of the salaries and sort of leave it out here kind of in the town and only report half the salaries in our own financials. And then lastly, because we bought the copier, we haven't had depreciation in a while. And so we had to change a bit of the way we did the financial statements to show the purchase of and the subsequent depreciation of the copier. But that gives you a sense of how kind of simple and straightforward it is. But any questions or any other pages people want to see from Paris?
Is there a special section, like if this thing happens and, or with any situation, if we claw back something, is there a special section on that, or do you just report that in your financials?
There is a specific question of whether or not we have adopted clawback provisions. But believe it or not, no. Now, they could still find that out. Like, for example, in our annual report, not the annual report I reference here, there is a section that I tend to, like last year, it would have talked about Moly Magnetics, and they're way behind in their jobs, and we've begun to have some discussions. If they take the time to dive into that, they would. Now, in this year's case, it will show up, but it will show up only because the JNR door pilot will end, and it's obviously ending prematurely.
Maybe there's an example of that company that bought the 10 acres on the corner.
Yeah, Praxair.
That decided they didn't want to do that anymore.
Yeah.
That wasn't a clawback, that was just that they changed their mind and we bought it back, right?
You could kind of consider it a little bit of a late clawback, right?
It was an abandonment of the pilot.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say it was a
So
clawback.
when we reported that was just like a late
Well, that will
purchase?
show up, but that will only show up because the previous year wouldn't have us having that land on our property report.
Right.
And then the next year, that land would come back onto our
So that
property
just
report.
shows
Yeah.
Just-
Yeah, it's a good question, that there isn't kind of a more, and I think the problem is, Paris, remember, is for every kind of public authority you can think about, from sewer and water district on down to whatever. So certain things that maybe are more germane to the IDA, it may be more challenging for them to specifically call it.
Oh, because that wouldn't exist for a
Oh,
while.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. But again, so if they do, I get, remember, they called last year on that silly financial piece. There is a possibility that they look close enough to pick that up. I don't mean that in a negative sense, I mean that in a positive sense, so. But, okay. The only other thing, and I'm not gonna present it to you, and we'll talk more about a bit of a hiccup in the board meeting in terms of the ability to do it, is that, we have our report card, and that report card's important. It's an important tool for the board. It does get indirectly referenced in the Paris report. But, maybe because Mark was like just a crazy Excel spreadsheet maven that just had fun trying to have the most complicated, the most interconnected report card, that it becomes frankly almost like a, oh geez, if we start that, then it's gonna be this, and it's gonna be that, and that. Chris and I had begun to get, maybe even back to Sarah, I think what my plans are gonna be, and it still will be more than adequate for the board, is to simplify that, but only in the sense of taking one mega report and probably having 3 reports that keep the information focused, like the jobs information, the current and cumulative pilot payments. It's just a bit crazy when you're trying to make all those columns hang together. So we'll still have a report card. It just may be broken into 2 or 3 more simplistic, focused scenarios versus trying to parse out a particular piece of information. But I think we're obviously committed to current year and then cumulative over the life of any pilot. So we'll tackle that in the summer and get it back out to everybody. But I think that's the only items I had. Anything anybody else wanted to bring up under our annual governance committee?
Nothing here.
All right, good. I appreciate it, but, good, all right. Mute this until I get back open.
take this down just while I'm talking. All right, so we're live online, everybody. We'll get started, I guess it's 7:59 today. We've got, both Dan and Todd on.
Just Todd, we think.
Just Todd. Oh, I thought Dan, I thought he said he was there as well. Okay, oh, we got Todd. All right, so Secretary's report, I'm guessing we have no other communication. We can
Nope.
just go straight to the minutes. All right. So everyone had a chance to look over the minutes, and I'll take a motion if there's no corrections to be made from anyone other than Darlene, since she was not here and can't make a motion to accept the minutes.
I'll make that motion.
Thank you.
I'll second it.
Janine and Bob. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed?
Aye.
Okay, and we'll jump right over to the treasurer's report.
Okay. Statement of cash transactions, you can see the only income for the month was our interest of $271. We transferred the money to the checking account to pay our bills, and then our disbursements last month, the town, the standard number, town for travel. The JB Computer Services, I believe, was email, setting up Chris's email, was that the
Correct.
one?
Yeah.
Okay. And then we have our Seaman Norris incidentals to the Rapids Road land purchase, I believe, is what that number is. And then WSP is the old Ecology and Environment, so that's for the survey out at the property. So that was our statement of cash transactions. Going to the income statement, you can see those numbers again totaled up. We have the financial services number for Kate, the attorney fees, the meeting expense, and that purchase of land and ROW is the combination of the Seaman Norris and WSP number from the page before, totaling a net loss for the current month of $14,511. Moving to the balance sheet, checking account 100,801, savings account 1590,523. Total assets 2705,068. We have the bonds payable, as you can see, the land bond and then the long-term bond, and the accrued liability for the GM litigation, totaling all up to the fund balance of $1371,825, and then the total number there again at the bottom. And that's it for the treasurer's report.
Does anyone have any questions? If not, I'll take a motion to accept the report as presented.
So moved.
Darlene and Todd. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Thank you. Bob, the bills.
Okay, the bills for the town of Lockport, monthly contract, Tom for some February mileage, quarterly Seaman Norris, quarterly Kate, and then Lumsden and McCormick, final billing for the 2020 audit of $950. So pretty straightforward, and I'd like to make a motion to pay these.
Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Any questions by anyone? All those in favor of paying the bills?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Thank you.
Thank you.
And Tom, we'll jump right into your neck of the woods.
And just some minor updates, if you will. The first thing you should come across in your packet is what I'm going to call the preliminary report of the rock depth work. You recall that we contracted with PSI. You have both the first, there's 16 out of 20 results, and then the second page shows you the location of the various borings. Couple comments. One, there's a little bit of a challenge in the sense that the first day PSI was out there, they got out there and their truck wouldn't work. I was driving out to see them and take a picture, and I see like the two trucks driving by me. I'm like, wow, this is like 8:30 in the morning. I can't be done yet, but whatever. Fixed it, came back the next day, had done 16 of these borings, and I went out again just to see them, take some pictures, and lo and behold, they buried the boring truck, and I had to get Dave to come out and yank them out. And so they planned to come back and do these other 4 when it dried out. It was strange in the sense we all know how dry the spring has been. That's a piece of land that gets farmed. It certainly doesn't have any standing water on it, but be that as it may, there is some unfinished business. We actually will get a more substantive report, but I was pleased that they provided this information. And I guess the takeaway is that this piece is no different than others, that the depth of bedrock is quite shallow. And I guess the only other decent piece of news, I suppose, is that there really isn't any portion of it yet, at least of those 16, that shows any kind of significant variation from kind of a 3-foot-ish median, if you will, of the results. So I'll continue to stay on them as to when they think they can do those other 4, and then we'll get them more. But these are helpful in and of itself. I did go ahead and forward it to Project Jammin that had asked about it. That's still a bit strange in terms of how active that project is in terms of their decision-making, but this was important to them, so they do now have a copy of that, so that's that. We did complete our first e-newsletter in a number of years. We have maintained that constant contact subscription, and Chris was able to put this together after I gave her the various pieces of information. It goes to about 100 email addresses, active, validated email addresses. If any of you have some others, you can let us know. And the second time that we checked, we were just below a 50% open rate, which Constant Contact can tell you, which isn't horrible. I mean, obviously, I'd like it higher, but, and nobody wrote back to try and unsubscribe. So we'll certainly do a couple more this year. The next thing I want to do, it might not be totally in order, is the brush hogging bids. You have like a summary sheet. I have particulars if you want them. But we sent I had gotten, the second bill from the current vendor last year, and I thought, geez, that's a bit of an increase, and it had been a while, so why not send it out to bid? It went out to 5 vendors, including the incumbent, and I will say to you, it was a very enlightening experience, as are a lot of things for me the first time we kind of go through it. The most enlightening piece was, well, we knew the GM land was brush hogged. I had no idea that it was Lawnsmith, the incumbent vendor, doing it, so that when you looked at the type of quantity of acreage that we really were paying for brush hogging for, it really was sort of the deal of the century. You're talking about 13 acres in the park that they brush hog, because remember, they don't currently brush hog the 10 acres in the corner of Junction and Enterprise, which we'll talk about in a second. And then it's about 20 acres at the GM land in terms of on each side of the road and sort of around the wetlands, if you will. So it took me a while to call the other vendors back and say, well, wait a minute, we've got this additional land, what would your price be for that? And I took a couple trips out for both Lawnsmith, who is the incumbent, and then that Ground Effects as well. But anyway, long story short, 3 bids out of the 5. I broke it down by what they bid for the IDA park, what do they bid as an alternative that at some point in the future we need to do the 10 acres, and then what's their bid for the GM land. And it's obviously quite clear that we should remain with Lawnsmith for the IDA park and the GM acres. Their new bid is $5,520. Ground Effects is $9,800, and T&D Landscape is $5,530. So again, I'll reach out to Lawnsmith and let them know that they were the low bid and have them go ahead and schedule it. The only other thing that came to light is the 1.4 acre parcel between Yahoo and up north hosting, this piece right here. That, over the years, somehow didn't get brush hogged, and so now it's beyond brush hog ability. One of the vendors, I'll have to go back and look, was willing to kind of go in with a more substantive machine and knock that out. And I may talk to them and see if they're still willing to do that, even though they weren't being picked as the overall vendor, and just have that project done, because the number of saplings and trees and so on is pretty significant. It doesn't look anything like the other properties of ours out there. I'm not sure how it got missed 2-3 years ago and then now has advanced, but I'll have a sort of a sidebar discussion with them. The other thing I've started, they aren't posted to the website yet, but, you know, again, I continue to hear time and time again that, you know, post the pandemic, that site selectors and commercial realtors, at least for their first blush, are going to do more and more kind of digital research, you know, online research, if you will. So, in addition to the drone video that we have, which I think is super helpful, I've begun to do a series of, violating a copyright, I realize, but street view videos of the various properties in the park. They're about a minute long is all, but I've gone out on Saturdays, because I tried the weekday one day, and it was just like taking pictures of cars in the parking lot. So last Saturday I did intro design, custom laser, and XPL logistics, and again, they're about a minute long, and we'll find a section on the website to upload them to as separate videos that people can take a look at. I, for the most part, comment on who are they, how long they've been in the park, anything happened most noteworthy, and then what's the nature of the business and stuff. So I'll let you know when they're up, but, you know, I'll just keep knocking those out. The only work is to throw together a quick script before I go out there, if you will. The next thing in your packet is the Western New York Industrial Real Estate Development Strategy. At this point, I've given you a cover letter, but I've also given you these 2 pages that are specific to the IDA Park, and then just the cover page of the executive summary that I'm certainly willing to share with people. Real quick summary. Invest Buffalo Niagara partnered with Newmark, which is really one of the nation's leading site selectors, but I would say economic development consultants, to do this pretty intensive, ended up being over 2-year study to not only take a look at the lack of industrial land and buildings in the 7 counties of Western New York, but to evaluate a handful of properties and buildings in Western New York as a comparative to other things they see. And then they took a look really at the kind of collective economic development processes and issues that exist in Western New York, and compared them to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Columbus, Ohio, and Spartanburg, South Carolina. They so far, actually now they're done. They did a major presentation to all of us as investors / participants in our case. Then they did the elected officials, and they've just recently done commercial realtors. The one thing I'd mention just before I look at our 2 pages is the next phase is that they're envisioning putting together 5 task forces that tie to the general areas of comment and suggested strategies from Newmark. And those are site development and readiness, business recruitment and readiness, workforce development, incentives, and then marketing. When I had the call the other day to go over our individual results, I volunteered for either site development and readiness, or workforce development. I think those are the two most important areas, at least. So we'll see. I'll let you know which task force I end up on. But particular to our property, what happened is they went out to like 3 counties, including obviously Niagara County. They said, hey, who might you recommend as a site that we could use? And somewhat surprising, Niagara County Economic Development suggested us in our park. And as much as there was a fair degree of work, I still think it was more than worthwhile to participate. So this page in the front with the bar graphs really takes a look at both land and buildings. Obviously, in our case, it was only the land that's in the park. You can kind of see with the red line the median of where they felt the property assessment ranked. Our property, which was the town of Lockport IDA, is just below the median. There may be a particular series of algorithms that lead to that ranking, but more importantly, a number of them are included on the next page. So if you want to switch to the template with the photo, we can take a little bit more time on that, because that does get into things. What I like about this is, and if I was to show you our commercial listing service that's on Invest Buffalo, more and more now, this is kind of what a site selector or a commercial realtor would see, and we certainly have all of our available properties on that. But this came from Newmark with both the large aerial and then just a random shot on Commerce Drive. It's actually my truck in there, I didn't realize that. You're looking at the substation that's between the 2 different Yahoo sections, but whatever. In looking at ours, when you look at the 5 or 6 rankings, the first one is overall property image and character. We scored 5 out of 9 there. Next one, quality and fit in immediate surroundings, 15 out of 27. Next, quality of site for industrial purposes, 5 out of 9. And then site utility and readiness, 15 out of 27. Maybe more importantly, the pros, they don't see any major impediments to the industrial park. They think its proximity to the GM maybe is a positive, and that it's owned by us, and that there's pilots available. Cons, I think they've picked up on some materials I've sent them, that if you had a client that had really significant water or water treatment needs, that there's some capacity issues within the city of Lockport. Maybe most importantly, and I think what led to a lot of those mediocre rankings, is the very limited land availability in the park. And certainly they picked up on, from me, the electric infrastructure changes. I'll be honest, another reason I picked potentially being on the site development and readiness pieces, we've talked before about just what a challenge our current electricity provider is from an economic development perspective, and I guess I want to continue to beat that drum. So when I had my individual meeting with Invest Buffalo the other day, I sort of said, well, what else did we hear? It's hard from those numbers, and claimed that they had very positive feedback. They loved the flow of the park. They loved the layout. It's well maintained. It was obviously, there was good planning. The only real negative beyond the utilities we talked about was, there isn't much land left, and what land is there are really small parcels that obviously will and continue to prevent us from being a player in, I don't think, last mile e-commerce project or something like that. So I'll continue to keep you all informed as to when these task forces move forward. If you're even just paying attention to the popular press, I do think you've seen some developers start to recognize the unbelievable shortage of warehouse space in particular, but others, and you're starting to see a few announcements around spec buildings. So hopefully this study stimulated developers or commercial realtors even more. And again, if somebody wants the 28-page annual or the executive summary, I'll be happy to share it. You can just let me know. Last two quick things is, I've mentioned before that I am helping staff the town's website design review committee. We have narrowed it to two entities. We'll probably finalize or formalize that decision this afternoon. When we meet, we just had a handful of questions, and then we also put together a draft of what we would expect to see in a virtual demonstration and discussion with those two vendors. So that'll continue to move forward. At this point, I think it's important for you to realize my recommendation is that the IDA website stay separate and stay standalone. I don't feel that way about Transit North. I might even argue that, Transit North, if you really look at that website, that was a great job by Mark to really try and attract substantive retail development. I mean, like big box development. And so it's loaded with traffic counts, demographics, and so on. And it really isn't even, and, hey, Popeyes is here now, hey, Well Now is here now, and so on. So I do think you'll eventually see that Transit North gets melded into the town. My main reason for suggesting that the IDA stay separate is my earlier comment. The fact that we now know site selectors and commercial realtors are more and more going to be using online. I don't want our information buried, on the 10th page of the town's website. We'll ask when we meet with the two finalists whether that decision does anything to the cost. It may lower the cost because they may have been anticipating significant redesign and redo of our pages. So we'll let you know. And then lastly, I did sit through it. Really, sometimes you sign up for these webinars, and you think, whatever. Signed up on a great webinar on 5G. I think that, and not just in general, and geez, how's it work on your cell phone? Not really that case. It was a really well-developed webinar by the New York State EDC with folks from Global Foundries and what they're doing on the chip side to a great business in Syracuse called JM&A that really is taken off on non-internet-based private networks in places throughout Arizona. And I don't know, at some point we may get a push from folks in the park that said, even we want reliable 5G and, maybe the infrastructure can or can't support it, and would we consider, kind of a private network that you see like this JM&A doing. But again, it was super worthwhile. And then most of the New York State EDC, our trade association, kind of has their winter meeting and their annual meeting in the summer, but they have moved it to September, I think in hopes of that finally being able to be in person. There hasn't been any registration yet. Obviously, I will sign up to go to it when it comes. But let me just check. I think that's all. We have really two items under, one under old business, and I guess one can be under the attorney's report. For attorneys, you want to talk about let me cue up the farming piece. I have mentioned before how frankly embarrassed I was that we were unaware of who was farming that land, and reaching out to at least the previous executive director and a few other folks, not able to determine who that was. So we put together a letter that not only went to neighbors, because there are a few neighbors that do farm, but also a few other people. And ironically enough, at the same time we were successful with reaching out to who actually is farming it, Dave Miller had gotten our letter and said, well, you just should have asked me a long time ago. I've known all along who farmed it. So I would have thought I would have asked him in the past, but long story short, that land is farmed by the Ohal farm that's over on Comstock Road, which is a substantive initiative. And while this land is not obviously contiguous to the farm over on Comstock, it's close enough. So we have had conversation with them about our desire to put in place an agreement and have a small, rental fee. So I can turn it over to Tom with that bit of
So,
background.
Tom and I had spoken, I drafted a lease yesterday, actually, that I don't have in front of you today. I want to talk to you a little bit about the terms. It's going to be a very short, straightforward lease. The real purpose of it is to protect the IDA in the town in terms of any indemnification in case something was to happen, and ensure that there's proper insurance in place from the farmers to cover us, and that they'll add the IDA in the town as additional insureds. And then there's a small component in terms of cost. Tom's done a little bit of research. Seems to be the going rate is somewhere around $50 an acre
Mhm.
for, for the season of farming. So we thought it'd be a good idea to make it a $500 a year rental lease agreement. The way I've drafted it is that it'll just renew every year, on the first of the year unless it's terminated by either party. I'm gonna put in there a clause that either party can terminate it on 30 days' notice. Certainly the IDA is going to want to be able to, cease farming operations if there comes a project that's available. So I've put it in there. I don't know if it'll really happen. I think if a project came available, it'll take long enough that, before there's shovels in the ground, that we would just simply terminate the lease. But I did put a clause in there that if it's terminated mid-year, that we would prorate the year and pay them back. I also put in there, if they were to terminate it mid-year, that they're not gonna be able to prorate it. I don't want them to go take their last cutting of hay and then terminate it that year and, get a couple $100 back. So it's essentially that. It's set just a few different clauses, the insurance indemnification, the termination clause, so I can circulate that. But really, that's what it is. We could do a motion on that to allow the IDA to enter into a lease on those terms contingent on the attorney's approval of the contract. And if there's any other terms or conditions that you might be able to think of now that I haven't thought of, let me know. So I could open that to discussion if anyone could think of anything. The other issue, so if we could do a motion on that, and then also, Tom, I think my father mentioned to me, is the parcel that the IDA purchased from the town also being farmed?
Well, just before I lose this other thought, I would say the other thing I would have you keep in mind beyond the kind of token $500 rental is that we're also avoiding a $1,600 brush hogging charge for
Right.
that property, so.
And I do mention that in the wherefore clauses, that it's also beneficial to the IDA to keep the property clean, avoid brush hogging, make it more.
Yeah. To your other question, I think I do need to do some research. I do believe in some of the satellite pictures that I've looked at of the Rapids Road, that a couple portions up closer to Rapids, not the section way back by Kimberly Drive, that's much more wooded. But I do think there might have been a couple, so let me start the research on that, just to be sure as well.
I think Mark's aware of it, Mark.
As to who might,
Supervisor,
Okay.
he's aware of it.
yes,
Just talk to him.
Just, in terms of the 10-acre parcel, I just wanted to be sure, Tom, do you know, it's just, is it hay that they're growing?
correct.
Okay, so that's the other thing I put in there, is that they're limited to growing vegetative hay, grass, something along those lines, that they can't put any structures on the property, they can't use it for commercial, they can't put any type of sales apparatus or anything like that out by the roadside, so it's limited purely to growing, vegetative type.
And would you put language about pesticides or herbicides or any?
I haven't considered it.
I mean, for hay, they don't do anything, right? They just let it grow
I
and
suspect that's true.
cut it?
Would you like me to put something in there?
Yeah, maybe,
Well,
just,
I mean, we
yeah,
wouldn't
it
want them,
doesn't look like they do
we
because
wouldn't want them
it's
to contaminate it with,
Right. Roundup.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'll add that in there. Given the fact that there may also be these other farmers using the other land, we could do a motion that the IDA enters into or agrees to the terms of the contract that I'm providing, for all farmers for this year on any portions of property owned by the IDA. And, it would be based on the same approximately $50 per acre. And then, if that's approved, we can circulate it to all farmers that may be farming any parcel.
Does anyone have any questions or input? I think it makes sense for us to move in that direction, because then it's official with the farmers and it's off of our hands in terms of any other concerns.
Do we believe at this juncture there's only those two?
Yeah, yeah.
And is there anything we could do in the GM property, or is that just totally off the table because of?
No,
Wetlands
the only thing
or
that's different about the
roads or
GM property is that,
birds or-
that's, oh, in terms of,
could we let farmers in there? I mean, if there's a bird concern or
yeah,
whatever.
I think it would have to be a hay and
Better
grassland.
go there.
And I think that authorities have talked about only one time a year that you can cut it at a particular time, so that may be inconsistent with what a farmer would want to do.
Got issues that aren't resolved yet.
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
think we
yeah,
should
okay.
hold off on it.
Okay, so let's have a motion as Tom presented, as Tom Seaman presented, for, allowing him to enter into agreements, with the general parameter being the $50 per acre, going rate for basically hay cutting, conditions on there of no commercial sales and basically no environmental damage and whatnot. If that's agreeable to everyone, we could take a motion on that in a second.
So moved.
Thanks, Harry.
Second.
We'll go with Bob by a nose on that, Janine. And in the absence of any other questions, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Thank you.
Okay.
That's good. Okay.
I do have a couple items for executive session for consultation with attorney.
Okay. Do we have, just going in order, Dan or Tom, did you have anything else with not counting executive session?
The one thing I wanted to back up to and address was, the brush hogging
Oh,
contract.
okay.
I can't find it in my packet, but I think you mentioned it was so the recommendation for the board then would be
Lawn Smith.
Lawn Smith
No.
for a total of $5,100.
Not even, really, just
No.
the 3520,
Oh,
because we're not including that 10 acre.
Oh, I see, okay. All right, so I just wanted to mention, I'll draft the front end of that contract for you, with their proposal, if you circulate their proposal
Sure.
over to me. With regard to your procurement contract, you don't need a board action to enter into that, I think that's within your discretion there. But I will draft a front-end contract that, again, will have your typical indemnification and insurance language is the primary focus of those. And that it'll attach their proposal to the back of it.
Good.
Did we set that up as a 1-year proposal, or did they give us a 3-year or any, was there any
I think his
term?
preference, I have it right in front of me. I think I don't have it, but
I
I
think
think
the
his
last
preference may have
time,
been 3 years.
yeah, I was gonna say, I think the last time we had done it, it was a 3-year term.
He doesn't say, but I think my discussions with him may have been that he quote wasn't surprised that it had gone out to bid because the quote 3 years were
Yeah.
up. So I'll ask for something a bit more substantive than this before we send it over to Tom, but I'll specifically ask about that, because I think he,
Why don't we just put an automatic renewal
yeah,
from year to year for 3 years? And then if they don't wanna do it, they can notify us.
yeah, okay.
All right, and then, looks like we did go through everything else, so we'll take a motion to go into executive session for consultation with attorney.
So moved.
Harry,
I'll second it.
Darlene, thank you. If we could hit the mute button.
Probably a little longer. Sorry.
It's okay. All right, if, and we don't have anything we need to circle back on.
No.
We have no motion that needs to
No.
taken care of. All right, so our next meeting then is Thursday, May 13th, 8 a.m. right here. Anyone who needs to phone in can certainly still do that. And if you have a problem with that attendance, just drop Tom an email so that he's aware. And other than that, I'll take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Harry? Bye. All those in favor? Aye. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Todd.
All right, take care.
Yep, take